There's a particular kind of tiredness that some people carry, invisible to everyone around them. It's not the fatigue that comes from physical exertion or late nights, but something that lives deeper, something that has been accumulating for years, maybe decades. It's the exhaustion of someone who has spent their entire life making sure everyone else is comfortable, happy, satisfied. Someone who has learned to read rooms like other people read books, scanning for tension, for disappointment, for any sign that they might need to adjust themselves to keep the peace. If you've ever felt your stomach tighten when someone seems even slightly upset with you, if you've ever said yes when every fiber of your being wanted to scream no, if you've ever felt like your entire worth depends on whether other people approve of you, then you know this exhaustion intimately. You know what it means to be too nice. And beneath that niceness, beneath that constant accommodation and that endless flexibility, there's a darkness that psychology is only beginning to fully illuminate. Because being too nice isn't actually about kindness at all. It's about survival, about fear, about a fundamental belief that you don't deserve love just for existing. It's about living your entire life as a performance, terrified that if the mask slips, if people see who you really are, they'll leave. And that performance, that constant vigilance, that perpetual self-erasure, it leaves marks that go all the way down to your neurons. Insight 1. The mask we mistake for virtue. On the surface, there seems to be nothing wrong with being nice. In fact, our culture celebrates it. We praise the person who never complains, who always volunteers, who bends over backwards to help others. Teachers love the compliant student who never causes trouble. Employers value the worker who never pushes back, who takes on extra projects without complaint. Friends gravitate toward the person who always agrees, who never creates conflict, who makes everything easier. Society has essentially created a reward system for self-erasure, and we call it being nice. But here's what most people don't understand, what gets lost in all that praise and validation. There's a difference between genuine kindness and people-pleasing, and that difference is everything. Kindness stems from self-expression, from a secure sense of self. When you're genuinely kind, you help others because it aligns with your values, because it feels good to contribute, because you want to, not because you need to. There's no hidden agenda, no desperate hope that your helpfulness will make someone love you, no anxiety about what might happen if you don't comply. Genuine kindness doesn't require reciprocation. It doesn't keep score. It doesn't leave you feeling resentful or depleted afterward. But people-pleasing operates from a completely different place. It's driven by insecurity, by fear of rejection, by a deep-seated belief that your value depends on your usefulness. Every act of helpfulness is secretly transactional, even if you don't consciously realize it. You're not giving freely, you're trading your time, your energy, your authentic self in exchange for acceptance, for approval, for the fleeting reassurance that you matter. What makes this particularly insidious is that people-pleasers often don't even recognize what they're doing. They genuinely believe they're just being nice, just being helpful, just being a good person. They've internalized the message so deeply that their worth depends on their agreeableness that they can't imagine an alternative. They look at their constant accommodation and see virtue. They look at their inability to say no and call it generosity. They look at their total lack of boundaries and think it means they're loving. But underneath all of that, underneath the smile and the compliance and the endless flexibility, there's a terror so profound it shapes every interaction. It's the terror that if you stop being useful, if you stop being agreeable, if you stop making everyone else's life easier, they'll realize you're not worth keeping around. The person who's too nice has learned to associate love with performance. Somewhere along the way, usually very early in life, they absorb the message that their needs don't matter, that their feelings are inconvenient, that their job is to manage everyone else's emotional experience. They learned that asking for what they want is selfish, that expressing disappointment is manipulative, that having boundaries is cruel. And so they stopped. They stopped asking. They stopped expressing. They stopped having limits. They became infinitely flexible, endlessly accommodating, perpetually pleasant. And everyone around them benefited from this transformation, everyone except them. Because while they were busy making sure everyone else was comfortable, while they were bending themselves into impossible shapes to avoid disappointing anyone, they were disappearing. Piece by piece, year by year, they were erasing themselves. Insight 2: When survival becomes your personality. To understand why someone becomes too nice, you have to go back to the beginning, to the place where personality forms and survival strategies are learned. People-pleasing behavior is often rooted in childhood trauma bonding, in experiences with caregivers who were neglectful, unpredictable, or abusive. Picture a child growing up in an environment where love feels conditional, where approval must be earned, where making a mistake might mean punishment or withdrawal of affection. In that environment, the child learns very quickly that safety depends on reading the adults around them perfectly, on anticipating their needs, on never causing problems. They learn that their own needs are dangerous, that their feelings are burdensome, that the only way to maintain connection is to make themselves useful. This survival response is sometimes called the fawn response, one of the lesser-known trauma reactions alongside fight, flight, and freeze. When a child can't fight back against a threatening situation and can't escape it, when they're trapped in a relationship with someone they depend on for survival, fawning becomes the only option left. They learn to appease, to accommodate, to do whatever it takes to keep the dangerous person calm and satisfied. And here's the truly devastating part about this adaptation: it works. In the short term, it keeps the child safer. The parent who might have lashed out in anger stays calm when the child is compliant. The caregiver who might have withdrawn stays present when the child is helpful. The volatile household maintains a fragile peace when the child becomes its emotional manager. The problem is that this strategy, this way of moving through the world, becomes so deeply ingrained that it continues long after the original threat has passed. The specific origins of people-pleasing can take different forms, but they share common threads. Sometimes it's inconsistent parenting, where a child never knows if today's behavior will be praised or punished, creating an environment of unpredictability that teaches hypervigilance. Sometimes it's emotional neglect, where a child learns that their feelings don't matter, that no one is coming to help, that the only way to get any attention at all is to focus entirely on others. Sometimes it's growing up with parents who have serious mental health issues or personality disorders, parents who expect their children to meet their emotional needs instead of the other way around. In these situations, the child essentially becomes a therapist, a caretaker, an emotional support animal for an adult who should be caring for them. What all of these scenarios share is a fundamental disruption in attachment. In healthy development, a child learns that they are valuable simply for existing, that their needs matter, that they can depend on their caregivers to respond to their distress. They learn that the world is safe enough, that people can be trusted enough, that they don't have to earn love through constant performance. But when attachment is disrupted, when caregivers are unreliable or harmful or emotionally absent, the child develops what psychologists call an insecure attachment style. People-pleasers often display an anxious, preoccupied attachment pattern, characterized by fear of abandonment and a constant need to seek validation from others. They move through life believing that relationships are fragile, that people will leave unless given constant reasons to stay, that their value must be proven again and again and again. This becomes not just a strategy but an identity. The child who learned that survival meant being useful grows into an adult who doesn't know who they are outside of that usefulness. Their entire sense of self is built around being needed, being helpful, being the one who solves problems and smooths over conflicts and makes everything easier for everyone else. They're so focused on reading other people, on anticipating needs, on managing reactions, that they lose touch with their own internal experience entirely. If you ask them what they want, they genuinely don't know. If you ask them how they feel, They'll tell you about everyone else's feelings instead. They've spent so long performing niceness, performing agreeableness, performing endless accommodation, that they've forgotten there was ever a real person underneath. Insight 3: The neurological prison of approval. The psychological understanding of people-pleasing is revealing enough, but when you look at what's happening in the brain, the picture becomes even more troubling. Because these patterns don't just live in behavior or belief systems. They're written into neural circuits, into the physical architecture of the brain itself. Two brain regions play crucial roles in people-pleasing behavior: the amygdala, which processes fear and threat, and the prefrontal cortex, which handles decision-making and self-regulation. In someone who has become too nice, these systems function differently than they do in someone with healthy boundaries. The amygdala, that almond-shaped structure deep in the brain's emotional centers, is supposed to activate when we face genuine threat. It's part of our survival system, the part that helps us recognize danger and respond appropriately. But in people-pleasers, the amygdala becomes hyperactive, treating social situations where they might upset someone as if they were life-threatening emergencies, triggering fight-or-flight responses that elevate stress dramatically. When they anticipate having to say no to someone, when they imagine disappointing another person, when they even think about asserting a boundary, their amygdala starts firing as if they're facing physical danger. Their heart rate increases, their palms sweat, their stomach clenches. On a neurological level, the prospect of someone being upset with them registers as survival threat. Meanwhile, the prefrontal cortex, which should be helping them think rationally and make balanced decisions, gets overwhelmed. During heightened emotional reactions, the prefrontal cortex in people-pleasers becomes less active, meaning their rational thinking gets overridden by their panic response. They can't access the part of their brain that might say, "Actually, it's reasonable to decline this request," or "My needs matter too," or "This person being disappointed isn't actually dangerous." The emotional response takes over completely, and they find themselves agreeing to things they don't want to do, sacrificing their own well-being, saying yes when they mean no. There's also a powerful neurochemical component to people-pleasing that makes it genuinely addictive. When someone engages in behavior that pleases others, the brain releases dopamine, creating a reward loop that reinforces the behavior. Every time they accommodate someone, every time they help, every time they get approval or praise for being so agreeable, they get a hit of dopamine. Their brain learns that people-pleasing equals reward, and like any addiction, they find themselves chasing that feeling again and again. But just like with other addictive patterns, the rewards start to diminish over time. They need to do more, to give more, to sacrifice more to get the same feeling of approval. Research using brain scans has found that when people-pleasers disagree with others, they show notably increased activity in regions associated with cognitive dissonance and mental stress. The act of holding an opinion that differs from someone else's, of potentially causing conflict, creates such profound discomfort in their brain that avoiding it becomes paramount. This suggests that sensitivity to mental stress is linked to increased vulnerability to social influence. They're not just choosing to agree because it seems easier. Their brains are wired in a way that makes disagreement neurologically painful. The mental stress of standing their ground, of maintaining their own position, of risking disapproval, becomes so overwhelming that compliance feels like the only option. And then there's the impact on the body's stress response system. Chronic people-pleasing keeps the nervous system in a constant state of activation, always scanning for threats to relationships, always monitoring for signs of disapproval, always ready to jump into action to fix things. This chronic activation can dysregulate cortisol production, leading to either flattened responses where the body no longer reacts appropriately to stress, or exaggerated responses where minor stressors trigger major physiological reactions. Either way, the internal alarm system stops functioning as designed. The person who's too nice often reports feeling exhausted all the time, having trouble sleeping, experiencing unexplained physical symptoms. Their body is literally wearing out from the constant state of hypervigilance. Insight 4: The price of peace at any cost. The consequences of being too nice extend far beyond occasional feelings of frustration. They seep into every area of life, creating patterns of dysfunction that become increasingly difficult to escape. Perhaps the most immediate impact is on relationships themselves, the very thing people-pleasers are desperately trying to protect. People-pleasers are often drawn to those who will take advantage of them, and people who like to exploit others are drawn to those who are easy to manipulate. It's a tragic pattern. The person who will do anything to be liked, who never pushes back, who absorbs all the accommodation and compromise, becomes a magnet for narcissists, for users, for people who have no interest in reciprocity. These relationships become profoundly unbalanced. The people-pleaser gives and gives and gives, never asking for anything in return, never expressing their own needs, never setting limit. And the other person, whether consciously or not, learns to take. They learn that this is someone who will always say yes, who will always accommodate, who will absorb all the emotional labor and practical work without complaint. Over time, the people-pleaser starts to feel a growing resentment, a sense that they're being used, that the relationship isn't fair. But they can't express this resentment because that would create conflict, that would risk the relationship, that would make them the bad guy. So they swallow it. They keep giving. They keep accommodating. And the resentment builds and builds until it either explodes in a way that surprises everyone, or it turns inward and becomes depression. The impact on mental health is significant and well documented. People-pleasing is associated with chronic stress, anxiety, depression, anger, frustration, and depleted willpower. How could it be otherwise? These are people who spend every day suppressing their authentic selves, who ignore their own needs and feelings, who live in constant fear of disapproval. They're performing an exhausting act every single day, and they can never drop the mask because they believe the mask is all that makes them acceptable. The anxiety comes from the constant vigilance, the endless monitoring of other people's reactions. The depression comes from the loss of self, from the realization that they've disappeared into a role and they don't know how to get back. The anger comes from years of unmet needs, from feeling invisible, from the growing awareness that they've been exploited. There's also a profound identity crisis that many people-pleasers face. When your entire sense of self is built around being needed, being helpful, being agreeable, what happens when you try to figure out who you actually are? Many people-pleasers describe feeling empty, feeling like they don't have a real personality, like they're a chameleon who just becomes whatever the situation requires. They might be able to tell you in great detail about what other people like, what other people need, what other people think. But if you ask them what they like, what they need, what they think, they draw a blank. They've spent so long focusing outward that there's nothing left inward. They've given away so much of themselves that there's no self remaining to give to. People-pleasing can also lead to physical health consequences, including exhaustion, stress-related illnesses, and even issues with addiction as people turn to substances to cope with the mounting resentment and emotional pain. The person who can't say no, who can't set boundaries, who can't prioritize their own well-being, often ends up completely burnt out. They're running on empty, giving from reserves they don't have, and their body starts to rebel. They might develop chronic pain, autoimmune issues, digestive problems, insomnia. The body keeps the score, as they say, and the score shows years of self-neglect, years of putting everyone else first, years of believing that their own needs don't matter. Perhaps most poignantly, people-pleasers often struggle to receive genuine care from others. When someone does try to help them, to give to them, to put their needs first, they feel profoundly uncomfortable. They don't know how to accept care without immediately trying to reciprocate, without finding some way to turn the focus back onto the other person. In fact, allowing people-pleasers to constantly please you without reciprocity can actually be re-traumatizing, reinforcing their belief that they're only valuable for what they provide. Real intimacy, real connection, requires the ability to both give and receive, to be vulnerable, to let someone see you in your need. But people pleasers can't do that. They can only show up as the helper, the supporter, the one who has it together. And so even in relationships with genuinely caring people, they remain fundamentally alone. Insight 5: Breaking free without breaking apart. If you recognize yourself in this description, if you've felt that bone-deep exhaustion we started with, you might be wondering if change is even possible. The answer is yes, but it requires something that feels almost impossibly difficult for someone who's spent their life being too nice. It requires prioritizing yourself. It requires believing that you matter not for what you do, but for who you are. It requires learning to tolerate the discomfort of someone being disappointed in you, of someone thinking you're selfish, of conflict and disagreement and the messiness of real relationship. The journey often begins with awareness, with recognizing that what you've been calling kindness is actually a survival strategy, that what you've been calling generosity is actually fear, that what you've been calling love is actually self-abandonment. This recognition can be painful. Many people pleasers go through a period of grief when they realize how much of their life they've spent in service to others while ignoring themselves, how many relationships were built on a false self, how much they've sacrificed. That grief is necessary. It's allowing yourself to finally acknowledge that you deserved better, that you were worthy of care all along, that your needs mattered even when no one around you acted like they did. One of the most crucial skills to develop is the ability to set boundaries, to learn phrases like, "I need to think about that," or "that doesn't work for me," or simply, "no." For someone who's been too nice their entire life, these phrases can feel almost violent, can trigger intense anxiety and guilt. The brain that's wired to see disapproval as danger will scream at you that you're doing something wrong, that you need to take it back, that you need to fix it. This is where the real work happens. You have to sit with that discomfort. You have to allow yourself to feel the anxiety of someone potentially being upset with you, to feel the guilt of prioritizing your own needs, and to not immediately cave to those feelings. Therapy can be invaluable in this process, particularly approaches that address the underlying trauma. Cognitive behavioral therapy can help identify and challenge the distorted beliefs that drive people-pleasing, while EMDR therapy can help process the traumatic experiences that created those beliefs in the first place. But therapy itself presents challenges for people-pleasers. They often struggle to be authentic in session, to actually talk about their own problems rather than minimizing them or focusing on other people. They might find themselves trying to take care of the therapist, to be the good client, to show progress to earn approval. Part of the therapeutic work involves learning to show up as you really are, messy and needy and struggling, and discovering that you're still accepted. There's also the crucial work of learning who you actually are beneath the performance. This might sound strange, but many people pleasers genuinely don't know what they like, what they want, what brings them joy. They've spent so long adapting to others that they've lost touch with their own preferences and desires. Recovery involves experimenting, trying things just because you're curious, making choices based on what you want rather than what will make others happy. It involves giving yourself permission to be selfish sometimes, to put yourself first sometimes, to take up space and have needs and ask for things. The path isn't linear. There will be moments when you successfully set a boundary and feel empowered, followed by moments when you slip back into old patterns because the anxiety becomes too overwhelming. Change is hard, and you have to be patient with yourself, celebrating small victories while recognizing that transformation takes time. The goal isn't to become someone who never helps others or who walls off their heart completely. The goal is to develop the freedom to choose. To help when you genuinely want to help, not because you're terrified of what will happen if you don't. To give from abundance rather than depletion. To say yes when it feels right and no when it doesn't, and to tolerate the discomfort that comes with authentic living. What many people discover as they heal is that the relationships that mattered, the ones built on genuine connection rather than utility, don't fall apart when you start having boundaries. In fact, they often get stronger. The people who truly care about you want you to be authentic, want you to have needs, want reciprocity and realness rather than a one-sided dynamic where you do all the giving. Some relationships will end, and that's okay. Those were relationships that only worked because you were willing to disappear, and losing them makes space for connections that can hold all of you. The transformation from being too nice to being authentically kind is one of the most profound changes a person can make. It means learning that you're worthy not because of what you provide but because you exist. It means discovering that real love doesn't require you to be perfect or agreeable or endlessly accommodating. It means finding out that when you stop performing and start being real, you don't lose everything. You actually find yourself. And that self, the one you've been hiding and suppressing and abandoning for so long, turns out to be worth knowing. Turns out to be worth fighting for. Turns out to be enough, just as you are, without needing to earn your place in the world through constant self-sacrifice. If this resonated with you, if you saw yourself in these words, if you felt that recognition that comes from being truly seen, know this: you don't have to keep living this way. The pattern that kept you safe as a child doesn't have to define your adult life. You can learn to set boundaries. You can learn to prioritize yourself. You can learn that people's temporary disappointment isn't the end of the world. And you can discover that you're so much more than what you can do for others. You're a whole person with needs and wants and feelings that matter. You deserve care. You deserve rest. You deserve to take off that exhausting mask of niceness and discover what it feels like to just be. If you found value in this exploration of people-pleasing and want to dive deeper into the hidden psychology that shapes human behavior, hit that like button and subscribe to Flashlight Mind. We're here every week, illuminating the patterns that run beneath the surface of everyday life, helping you understand not just others, but yourself. Take care of yourselves out there, and remember, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit that you matter too.